which creates a situation in which many people are dependent from month to month, from paycheck to paycheck, just to be able to stay afloat. Related to that is also the situation that this tends to create in terms of allocation of land, and I'll come around to why I think this situation is the case in just a moment. The fact that most people are dependent upon landlords and dependent upon the good favors of a select class of people in order to rent month after month after month the place that they have to live, rather than a place where they can stand relatively securely and not have to depend on maintaining that same job that you go to week after week after week, just to keep from being thrown out onto the streets. There's a lot more that you can say. Those are sort of a couple quick things. What I want to come around to is the underlying explanation, the underlying structural features that help explain what the situation is and what the problem is. The 19th century anarchist Benjamin Tucker pointed out, this is during the 1880s, 1890s, and so forth, supposedly the heyday of American laissez-faire, pointed out that there were in fact 4 great monopolies which pervaded the entire economy and which systematically acted to constrain the options of workers, of ordinary people, to make a living for themselves, live on their own land, and otherwise provide for themselves without dependence upon a select class of people. And which tended systematically also to cut in favor of the classes that controlled employment and controlled land ownership. The 4 that he discussed in the 1880s and 1890s were the money monopoly, by which government takes control over the money supply and cartelizes the banking industry, thus concentrating control over access to capital in the hands of the bankers themselves and those favored parties who the bankers prefer to work with. The land monopoly, through which government controlled the allocation of land through issuing land grants to their preferred people rather than to people who were actually working it. If you sort of look at the history of the American West and what still is going on now in western states like my home in Nevada, where 50% of the land all across the West is still owned by the federal government. The tariff monopoly, which was not a monopoly for any one specific industry, but rather was the means by which local producers were systematically built up and fattened up by protecting them from competition across borders through the use of the protective tariff. And finally, the patent monopoly, which is the protection of patents and copyrights, which restrict the ability of people to freely and non-violently copy information, and trade the information that they've copied in order to favor the portfolio holders who can simply sit on productions that they've already been paid for and continue to reap monopoly profits by excluding all competition in the peaceful use of ideas. Now this is Tucker writing in like I said, about 1888 is when he was laying a lot of this stuff out. That's when he could count up 4 monopolies. If we tried to count them up today, the way the government economic regulation works today, God only knows how many you'd list. It's the infinite monopolies. There are sort of 4 in particular that are sort of 4, all of Tucker's monopolies are still with us. And they all have escalated rather than being curtailed. So, the money monopoly, right? Tucker was writing before the creation of the Federal Reserve, before the creation of the FDIC and the SEC and all these other structures. And similarly, the land monopoly and the patent monopoly have simply increased and escalated in enforcement. Now we have also utility monopolies, infrastructure monopolies, security monopolies, which are linked to the expanding size of sort of the warfare state and the police state, and broadly the regulatory monopoly, by which existing firms are propped up and safeguarded from competition by an incredibly Byzantine system of regulation and paperwork that systematically benefits market incumbents and systematically burns out those who would compete with them or provide alternatives to the way they do things. In a free society, without these 8 monopolies and without all the other countless government interventions that we have, I think there's every reason to believe that the kinds of market activity that we see today on the top that profit the most in this age of trillion-dollar bailouts would be systematically undermined and in fact systematically replaced by alternatives that are more localized, more grassroots, more decentralized, more directly in the hands of independent workers and people just sort of making a living informally for themselves without the corporate workplace or sort of the conventions of the forms of commerce that the state protects and defends. I'll come to you in just a second. I'm just going to wrap up real quick. Basically, the overall overarching position, which I'd be happy to talk about further and deal with further, is to fundamentally revise what we're doing and to look at sort of what really works and what doesn't work. If we're putting ourselves on the side of the socioeconomic status quo, on the side of the Fortune 500, the big businesses, then it's true that we'll be putting ourselves on the side of those who have the most money and the most political pull under the current system. If we try and side with the most oppressed, the most exploited, to identify ourselves with the criminalized and the excluded and the deported, then we'll be teaming up with and identifying our struggle with the struggle of those who have the least. But also, because they have the least to lose, right? Because without the current system, those who are best positioned often would lose the most, whereas those who would gain the most from the replacement of statism with freedom are those who are the most screwed over and the most excluded from society right now. That provides us with a sense of struggle and a sense of alliances, people who aren't going to back down and who have every reason not to be afraid of losing the system that we have. With this in mind, we must also remember the third lesson of the Wobblies, which is simply that there's more of us than there are of them. Those who have control over the elite institutions in the economy have far more resources to direct against us. But at a basic level, as Etienne de Boitier pointed out in his work on the politics of obedience, ultimately their ability to harass us and to shove us around and to send the cops after us depends on a chain of acquiescence, a chain of surrender. And if we can work to build alternative social institutions, things that provide people with connections of solidarity and unapologetic radical defenses of their rights as individual human beings, then we can provide a structure through which people can stand up and begin to challenge the status quo, rise up and begin to challenge the statist regime. Think about not only the Wobblies, but simply the Berlin Wall. Right? Did people in East Germany who wanted to be free to immigrate and to be free of totalitarianism, did they go to Erich Honecker and say, "Please, sir, will you tear down this wall"? No, they swarmed the wall and were able to take it simply because the regime in East Germany had lost the capacity to sustain itself, had lost the capacity to continue enforcing its rule. And they had made it lose that by years of preparation and by years of dissidence and forming up networks of resistance. And I think that's what we have to look to as our task today, to see that libertarianism is a revolution, and like these other successful struggles, it's a revolution that's made of people. That we're not for corporate capitalism, that we're not for some kind of flag-waving American traditionalism or any other kind of theo-nationalist mythology about the great days of the past. That we're not for conserving the social status quo at all, or returning to some idealized past that never really existed for the overwhelming majority of the people. We're for freedom, and we will win when we begin to act as such. Thanks.